Yeah, thanks, Sharonda. So I saw a lot of what came out of the affinity groups in terms of topics around gardening that you're interested in. So I did slide a few of those into our presentation today, but I'm mainly going to talk about just generally gardening with a limited amount of space, which I know applies to pretty much every single one of us in this room. So let me share my screen and we can start talking about it. Okay, so again, we'll be talking about gardening with limited space and a few other topics that I saw from those topics you all are interested in. And again, my name's Kyle Hood. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Garden Collaborative Extension Associate with the Steps to Health program at NCSU. And if you have questions during the presentation, please pop them in the chat. I'm not the best at monitoring the chat when I'm presenting. So if I miss your question in real time, I'll get to it at the end. But I'd love to hear any questions you have as we're going. So one of the main ways to garden in a limited space and get the most out of that limited space is by vertical gardening. So there's a lot of different ways to garden vertically. We'll kind of get into some sort of basic ways to do that here today, but it's really just the idea of growing things up or on like a wall or trellis rather than spreading them out on the ground. Most like seed packets you get will say, my tomato maybe needs 3 feet of space around it. But when we're talking about a vertical garden, it kind of flips that on its head and gives us access to a lot more space. So let's say you have a fence on your playground or some other existing infrastructure at your site or at your house. This could be a great way for you to, really get more space without building new garden beds and things like that. So even if you just have a trellis for like a patio, a wall could be a way to vertical garden. You can use bamboo sticks, which are abundant in some places if you have bamboo near you, even just sticks to have a vertical garden. So there's a lot of ways to go about this. So let's talk about some specific crops that are kind of meant to grow vertically or can be grown vertically. So the more traditional ones we think about in a vertical garden are like peas and beans. Like they need something to trellis on. They're not going to do well if they're just kind of sprawling on the ground. That's not really how they're meant. They're vining plants that climb up these things. Beans more specifically can grow up like one pole. So like a pole bean can grow up one pole, but a pea wants to branch out in all different directions. So like one pea plant could go in 5 different directions. So you need a more you need more than one pole for a pea. Ideally, beans are a little bit different. And then we're looking at things that you might not think about trellising or might not think about for a vertical garden, but honestly do really well. So things like melons, anything in the squash family. So, cucumbers, summer squash, gourds, all of those do really well in a vertical space and can save you a lot of room. So something like a pumpkin can take up a 12-foot by 12-foot garden bed. Like one pumpkin plant growing to its full capacity can take up a massive amount of space. So if I trellis that same pumpkin, maybe it's taking up a fourth of that space and it's, in a vertical way. So if we're limited on space, this is a great way to do this. Tomatoes also would really like to be trellised. Some tomato varieties are smaller and might not really need to hold on to something, but we'll talk about this more later. But there's intermediate tomatoes or indeterminate tomatoes that can grow indefinitely. So they'll grow until the next frost. So those tomatoes might get 8 feet high if I let them. And they'll definitely need to be holding on to something or they'll just kind of collapse under their own weight. And all the crops on this page, like they'll need their own space. So my beans, my tomatoes, my squash, they'll need their own space to trellis. I wouldn't try to trellis them all on the same pole. It just wouldn't work out. They'd be competing against each other. So thinking about some other ways to vertical garden with different kinds of plants, you could have something like you see in this picture, like a hanging hanging, pouches almost. And these are made of garden fabric. I have a lot of these at my house, and you can get pots that are made out of this garden fabric. But the nice thing about this is, like, on this picture, I have this on my wall, and now I could have 30 different varieties of plants that don't traditionally grow vertically, but now I'm just putting them in these pouches. And so you really want to focus on things that have like a shallow root system and maybe a short life cycle. So if we're talking about vegetable gardening, like lettuce would be perfect because I'm only picking lettuce for a few months. It doesn't need a lot of energy to create its leaves. So that root system can be kind of small and it can still be productive. Spinach, strawberries, some annual flowers would be good to have in these pouches, but this really expands the types of vegetables and herbs and flowers you can grow vertically. And again, this is just a wall at your house that you wouldn't be able to probably garden on at all, besides maybe, trellising some beans or something. So this is a good alternative if you're just looking for more space at your house or your childcare center. So living mulch. This is like in the gardening world, this is thought of as more of like a cover crop. So like maybe in winter, I just want a plant to be on my soil to stop erosion, to maybe become part of the soil next year. I could flip that. But you can also use this idea as a way to increase your space in the growing season too. And like the way it really works is that I'm using my plants, I'm putting them closer together so their leaves are almost touching, not quite touching, and the leaves are making a mulch for the soil. So my plants are so close together that there's no parts of dirt that are getting direct sunlight. So a good example would be like a really big squash plant. It's spread over my whole bed. Its leaves are covering the soil, and the plant is actually acting as a mulch. But you could use this in really any variety. So I could have, 10 kale plants in a bed that are pretty close together, and their leaves are actually covering the soil. They're closer than maybe the seed pack would tell you to put them, but I'm probably getting more out of those plants, even though they're closer than they're supposed to be. The only thing is you might not get as much per plant. So let's say my tomatoes want 3 feet of space, and I put them maybe a foot and a half apart. Their root systems will compete with each other a little bit, so they'll decrease the yield of each tomato, but I'll probably still get more in the long run. The biggest issue with this idea is that if plants are having moisture issues, some plants are prone to diseases. So squash is like a main one that if the leaves stay wet, if the plants are all over each other, then I might have some fungal diseases in the leaves. So I need to be careful I don't plant them too close. But it's really just an idea of maybe I'll plant these tomatoes a foot closer than the pack recommends, try to cram them into a smaller space, and maybe get more out of my space in the long run. So companion planting has a lot of benefits. I'm going to talk about how those benefits can be used to maximize your space right now, but there's lots of different reasons to do companion plants. In this picture, we have some marigolds beside maybe some carrots, I think that is right there. And marigolds are like a great example of a companion plant because they attract beneficial insects. So mainly ladybugs are one of the insects they attract. Ladybugs are going to eat a lot of the insects I don't want in my garden. So if I have an aphid problem, those ladybugs will come to those marigolds and eat the aphids on my other plants. But if we're thinking about gardening in a small space, I want to have companion plants that do well together and can kind of be layered almost. So probably the best example I can think of this is strawberries and asparagus. So strawberries are going to cover the ground in my garden and act as that living mulch, right? And then my asparagus are going to grow really tall, and not really compete with the strawberries in terms of space, because my asparagus needs a small amount of space. The strawberries are going to mulch the ground around the asparagus and keep the soil moist. And strawberries have a really shallow root system, and asparagus has a really deep root system. So they're not really going to compete for nutrients in that space. they can both be in the same space for years and years and years. So that's a really good example of, maximizing the space. I could have 10 strawberry plants there and 5 asparagus plants there, when traditionally you might not think of having them together. This is probably the most classic example of companion planting and kind of getting the most out of my space. So it's the three sisters idea of planting corn, pole beans or climbing beans, and squash all in the same bed, all kind of on top of each other, because they're kind of doing different things and they're growing in different ways. So we'll start with the squash at the bottom. It's acting as that living mulch as we talked about earlier. It's keeping my soil moist. It's stopping weeds from coming because squash is really just covering all the soil around the corn and the beans. And squash is actually really spiky too. A lot of varieties are almost hairy and kind of hurt to touch. So insects aren't too jazzed about climbing over squash plants, which could protect your beans and corn as well. And then corn's going to be in the same bed, obviously growing vertically. So they're not going to be competing so much for sunlight, really, but it is important, to keep them a little away from each other. And then the beans are kind of that third element. So the beans are actually just going to climb our corn stalks. So instead of having like stakes or trellis for my beans are just going to climb up the corn stalks. So you could plant all three of these pretty much right beside each other in a bed, and they would kind of work synergistically. And this is probably the best, most classic example of companion planting and really just getting the most out of your space. I talked about this in a previous learning burst, but it's also important for this topic too. So thinking about gardening with limited space, succession planning becomes almost vital. So knowing exactly what I'm going to put into the garden after I take something out, if I have a limited space, I can't be wasting time. So I have in this example spinach you plant in the spring. So I'm planting this spinach when it's still cold outside, when I'm still getting frost outside. The spinach is going to live its whole life cycle almost until like mid-May maybe. And then I'll put watermelons in. They'll live their whole life cycle until fall. I'll put kale in that same spot. So if I just said, I'm just going to put watermelon in this space, and I didn't think about maybe how I could maximize the space, I'm getting a third of the value from that one part of my garden. So just really thinking about what's my spring crop, summer crop, and fall crop I could plant in a row in that same garden bed. You can get like 3 times the value out of that single space. And I sent all you planting calendars, and you've seen this slide already, but when I'm talking about succession planning and getting the most out of my garden, having a planting calendar is pretty vital unless you just know all this already. So even if I miss maybe 2 weeks of the optimum time to plant something that this growing calendar says, that's a big part of the growing season. Like where I live, the growing season is only about 3 months. So if I'm 2 or 3 weeks off of my tomatoes, that's a big chunk of the growing season that I'm missing out on just by not looking at a growing calendar, which is a free resource to all of you. So just kind of planning my garden with the growing calendar in mind as a guide can really help maximize my space. Again, if I want to do like a succession planning on a bed, I can look at this and determine within reason exactly when I'll harvest and when to plant the next thing from spring to summer to fall. And I talked about this slide already, but this is really important when I'm talking about vertical gardening, because I was talking about sunlight in the context of where my garden is around a building or maybe around trees. But if I'm trellising all these beans and peas and squash, they're almost acting as a wall. So if I have, let's say I have my tomatoes and my pole beans right beside each other, and I'm trellising these beans. Well, now my tomatoes might be blocked from sun for half the day from my beans just being right beside them. And tomatoes need a lot of sunlight to produce fruit. Squash is a similar idea. All these fruiting summer, vegetables we think about like corn and tomatoes and squash, they need a lot of sunlight. So if I'm have all these trellises in my garden, which does save space, could mess up the sunlight of some things I'm really excited about, and could cut down the production of my, my favorite tomato plant or something like that. So thinking about where those beans are in relation to maybe your tomatoes is pretty important too. So containers is another great way you can save space. So, let's say you have a deck and there's not room for maybe a raised bed on this deck, but you could still very easily have, 10 pretty big sized containers on that raised on that deck, growing a wide variety of produce. I'm going to show you some pictures of the deck at my house that my son has his garden in. And again, there's not room for a raised bed on that space in my house. We have some pretty big grow bags, which I'll show you in a little bit. And I'm growing, 10 to 15 different types of plants at each time of the year in that space, just because I have some containers that kind of fit the area better. And you can grow just about anything in containers as long as they're deep enough. So these grow bags I'm talking about are 5-gallon containers. I could grow any root vegetable I want. I could grow tomatoes, squash, just about anything I can think of can fit in a container if it's the right size. If my containers are smaller, then I want to think about things that probably have a shorter life cycle. So again, kind of like those pouches. We talked about things like spinach and kale. Those are probably more ideal for smaller containers, maybe some herbs. Like in this picture, we have some basil. Flowers are good for smaller containers as well. So I talked about herbs some, but perennial herbs are a great way. If I have limited space, I could have a whole bed that's just perennial herbs that are really going to be growing the entire growing season. So pretty much as soon as it gets a little warm outside, all my perennial herbs are going to be ready to pick, and I can pick them all summer, really until that last frost. So I'm not really wasting any time per se, and you can prune them to fit your needs. So something like a mint, like a lemon balm, which is a type of mint that smells really good, is really fun to have in a childcare center because you can eat the leaves raw, you can rub it between your fingers and it smells like lemon. It almost needs no fertilizer. It can live almost indefinitely as long as it's not too cold. The only issue is it can take over a whole garden bed. So if you have a container of lemon balm, it can only get as big as the container. And so that would be a perfect plant to put in a container. And you'd have it from really March until October in most of North Carolina, eating it whenever you want to, making tea out of it, just smelling it, things like that. So other ones that are really easy to grow and you could harvest all year, all growing season long are rosemary, sage. In this picture, we have lavender. And again, you can prune them to your size. So a lot of these will take up as much space as you let them, but something like, a rosemary or a lavender, you can prune. If you want to take up a 1 foot by 1 foot space in your garden, you could prune it to fit that space really. So make sure you avoid space eating plants. And what do I mean by that? So I talked about trellising things like cucumbers and squash earlier, but if I just have, let's say, a pumpkin in a garden bed, it could take up a 12-foot by 12-foot garden bed. So, most of the garden beds I'm recommending to your sites are like 4 foot by 4 foot. So it's taking up 3 full raised beds if I'm just letting it do whatever it wants to. And if I have limited space, that's probably not the best option. Trellising that pumpkin will definitely help. It could take up maybe one of those garden beds, but just thinking about what's going to get the best bang for your buck in terms of space. Cucumbers are another one, or really any of these squash varieties take up a lot of space if I let them. So cucumbers might take up a 4 foot by 4 foot space. So I could trellis them. Now I talked about determinate versus indeterminate plants. Tomatoes are the main ones that we think about with this, but a determinate plant is going to grow to a set height. So that might be 3 or 4 feet for a tomato, and that's going to kind of have all its fruit at the same time. And if my space is limited, that's probably what I want. I want a smaller plant that's going to give me all the fruit at once versus that indeterminate tomato, which is going to grow really the entire year until it dies from frost or disease. And it can get as tall as I let it get, and it might just take up too much space in my small garden. So this is a picture of a grow bag that's on my deck. My son gardens in this grow bag, and this is not a big space. So all these plants you see in here are pretty young. So we have tomatoes, bush beans. Right underneath the tomato and the bush beans are just little tiny basil, some cilantro, and some dill. So traditionally, this tomato plant wants about 2 to 3 feet of space around it. Right now, it has like 2 or 3 inches of space around it. But the closest thing to that tomato is a bunch of basil. And the nice thing about that basil is I can pick the basil whenever I want to and eat it. Like in about a week, those basil will be, a few inches tall. They'll be perfect to just throw on a salad. I could throw them in a pesto, things like that. So kind of understanding when my tomato is going to grow and when I'm going to need it to have that space is important. So like right now, I can share all this space pretty easily, but in 2 months, that tomato is going to be so big it might crowd out everything. But kind of growing them phase by phase, those mushrooms are just there. They just came. I did not plant the mushrooms, so that was just a happy accident. But you can kind of plant things closer together, especially plants that I know I could harvest anytime. So cilantro, dill, basil, I can plant those plants. I can harvest them at any stage of their life, which means I could crowd them around other things that I'm not ready to harvest yet. So again, probably in 2 or 3 weeks, I'll harvest all of that cilantro, dill, and basil and eat it as a nice little microgreen in a salad or something like that. Here's another bed, and it's kind of the same idea. So we have 2 young tomato plants that look better than the last tomato plant did. And I have some red lettuce that I'm going to try to save the seed from. And again, these tomato plants don't have as much room as maybe the seed packet will tell you. But I know that in a few months, those tomatoes are going to be so much bigger than those lettuce, they'll be towering over them. They're not going to be competing for sunlight. I'll probably have harvested those lettuce seeds by then too. So I'll be removing the lettuce seeds. And there's really no harm in having them close together unless the leaves are touching. So kind of taking that smaller space and having things at different cycles of their life that I'm going to probably taking out those lettuce by the time those tomatoes really get going. Again, it's not maybe what a seed packet would tell you in terms of space, but it's just thinking about the life cycle of the plants, when I might harvest them, when they might need that much space. Because right now those tomatoes' root systems are pretty small. They're not really getting anywhere near the lettuce. So it's just kind of gaming the system a little bit. And this is my herb garden. This is kind of the last one I'll show you, but you see a bunch of small basil plants all between those rocks. And you see a lot of perennial herbs around the borders. So there's some Greek oregano, some sage, there's some strawberries. And again, those basil plants don't have as much room as a seed packet will tell you. Like the distance between that Greek oregano and that closest basil was like 6 inches. But what's really going to happen is I can harvest as much Greek oregano as I want to. So if I ever feel like they're getting too close to each other, I can just harvest that Greek oregano. I can go dry it, use it in the pasta or something. And that basil is just going to keep getting taller and bushier, and it's not really going to compete for shade or sunlight with that Greek oregano. So thinking about, how plants grow vertically is a great way to sort of save on the space aspect too. And the rocks are there really in my garden because my chickens scratch everything up and the rocks act as mulch. So when we're talking about mulch, like mulch can be living plants. In my herb garden, it's mulch is rocks. So mulch can mean a lot of different things. This just keeps the chickens from scratching my plants up, which happens without these rocks. So someone asked 2 weeks ago, if slugs were helpful or harmful animals in the garden. And the answer is that slugs will eat just about any plant they can get their hands on. And you might never see slugs because they really like to eat your plants at night. So they're almost like vampires, like they're not trying to get to the sun. So if it's a really rainy day, if it's overcast, they might come out in the daytime, but they're going to do most of their damage at night. And they do leave behind these nasty, slimy trails, and you might see that, but those trails dry up really quick. So you might not even know slugs are eating your garden. But if you see one slug or think maybe they're causing some damage, the best thing to do is kind of get rid of all the places they would have to hide. So let's say a raised bed, for example, they'll live at the corner of your raised bed where your raised bed intersects with the grass. They'll go hide down in there where it's nice and shady and wet during the daytime, and at night they'll come crawl up. So maybe I need to cut my grass shorter. If there's a bunch of stones around my garden or logs they could hide under, that's probably where they're hiding all day, and they're coming out at night and just feasting on your garden. Another fun idea you could do with kids is create slug traps. So it could be something as simple as like a paper towel roll in the middle of your garden that the slugs can hide in the daytime, like, or a big stick, even like a board that's raised just a little bit so slugs could get under there. Anywhere that's shady and is going to retain moisture, that's where they're going to hide all day. So you could create these sort of slug traps or environments where you know they'll want to go. And then in the middle of the day, you could go find them, trap them, maybe just move them, a long distance from your garden because they're obviously not very fast creatures. If I move them way across my yard, they might not find their way back over to my kale or whatever else they're eating right now. You can also purchase diatomaceous earth, which is essentially just rock that's very crumbled up. And I can take this rock and sprinkle it around my plants that I don't want slugs to get on. And when they try to crawl over this rock, it will cut their body. And they obviously don't like that, so they leave. That's one of the best organic ways to get rid of them. There's definitely some pesticides, but again, I just don't like spraying pesticides at a childcare center. So I'd much prefer something like diatomaceous earth. But if all else fails, your slug traps fail, they're still eating all your produce, just buy some diatomaceous earth. You could even have the kids at a childcare center put it around the plants, almost like a border, and that will keep slugs out too. So one of the topics that came up that you all wanted to learn about was rain barrels. So I made a few slides on kind of the uses of rain barrels and what you should be looking for if you purchase a rain barrel. But like the first thing I do want to say is that most rain barrels are taking water from a roof and putting it into the actual barrel, right? And that being said, that water is not safe for human consumption. So if I think about a tar roof or really any of that, so many things could be contaminating that water between the time it gets from the roof into the rain barrel. So you need to be careful about the water from a rain barrel. Not to say that at my home garden I might not think about this, but especially in a childcare setting, I'd be very careful with how I use the water in a rain barrel. And the main thing I would do is not water the edible parts of any plants with the water from a rain barrel. So just use that as precaution. I mean, really, you probably shouldn't be watering the edible parts of a plant with water anyway in most cases, but it's especially important with water that's not potable, that could have some sort of thing in it that you might not think of. So when we're actually installing a rain barrel, there's a few things we really need. We need that screen that you see in the picture. That's probably the most important part, because that screen's going to keep anything that we might not want in our rain barrel, that get our rain barrel clogged up. It's going to keep it outside. So rocks, small sticks. If any of those things get in my rain barrel, it's going to clog up that spigot and it's going to be a whole disaster trying to get those things out of there with any amount of ease. So we need a spigot, and we also need like an overflow valve. So if my rain barrel gets nearly full, there's a valve that will just release water so it doesn't overflow. Those are two of the most important things. Obviously, they have a spigot at the bottom, and what I would do is I would raise the rain barrel up so it's very easy for me to access the spigot. So I'm not having to, bend down too much. And so my watering can fit nice and neatly underneath the rain barrel to access the water. So those are a few important things when you're actually installing it. And again, like you want this beside a building with a downspout on that building going right into there. So you'll get a lot of water from the entire surface area of that roof. So one thing that you might not think of when you buy a rain barrel is that you don't want it outside in the winter, because when it freezes outside and that rain barrel is full of water, it's going to expand. It's going to probably break the rain barrel. So really around the late fall, when you're kind of done gardening for the year anyway, you want to empty your rain barrel, clean it out really well, and put it in a shed or something until next, spring, when it's not going to be freezing outside anymore. Because the last thing you want to do is spend, $100 on this setup, and then come October or November, depending on where you live, it freezes outside, and now your rain barrel is broken and kind of useless to you as a rain barrel anymore. There's also some questions about watering in general, and I know we talked about some of this, but I'll just kind of mention it again. Most garden plants need an inch of water per week, and that can be in the form of rain. So one easy way to kind of gauge this is to buy a rain gauge and put it near your garden. And at a childcare center, you can have the kids look at the rain gauge. It's pretty obvious, 1, 2, or 3, what happened that last week. And you could just empty it out every single week after you've got an idea of how much rain has come that week. So if it rained 2 inches last week, that means you don't need to be watering your garden this week. There's always special circumstances. Like if I'm transplanting a plant, they need more care and probably more water that first or second week of that life cycle after I transplant them. But as a general rule, you need about 1 inch of water per week. And when you do water, you want to water plants very deeply, like 10 seconds is a good rule for kids. But really you want to see water pooling on the surface of the soil, and then you want to stop. Because that's going to promote, root development. Those plants are going to go down looking for all the water you gave them. Rather than watering shallowly, 5 times a week, it's not going to tell them to go find water in the ground. They're going to have water there, 5 days a week if you do it shallowly more often. And if the bottom leaves of your plants are turning yellow, that's an indication that they're being overwatered. So if that's happening to you a lot, if you don't know why, maybe 3 or 4 different varieties of plants you have, those very bottom leaves are going yellow and it kind of moves up the stem, that's a good indication that you're putting too much water in those plants. And there's a question about irrigation in the garden. So I'll just spend a few seconds talking about 2 different kinds of irrigation you can go with. Drip irrigation is really hoses with holes in them in your garden beds. That's the simplest way I can explain it. And so you're burying them into your garden or putting them right on the surface of your garden, and it's watering exactly where you want them to water. So it's very efficient. It does take some setup and know-how, but if you want really efficient watering, less labor intensive, drip irrigation is the way to go. And if I just want something that waters my plants, that's less work, I don't have to set it up, just buying a sprinkler is a totally fine thing to do. You could turn it on twice a week for 10 minutes, 15 minutes for a small garden, and that'll water your whole garden. So those are just 2 ways I can kind of outsource that watering task. But again, if I have a really small garden in a childcare center, I probably don't need either one of these. But if that's becoming a problem, that's definitely something you could think about too. So that's the end of my presentation today, but if y'all have questions, please ask them now, or there might be some questions in the chat already. Oh yeah, Trish said lemon balm is great. Lemon balm is really great. There's so many different kinds of mint. So in my garden, I have grapefruit mint, I've seen apple mints. There's lots of different kinds of mint you could have all in the same little herb garden, and you could be smelling and tasting 6 different kinds of mint with kids in the same space.
I don't have a question, but just a comment. Your slides were so aesthetically pleasing that in my office with no windows, I felt really calm just looking at those beautiful pictures.
Thanks. I've never thought slides were my strong suit, so that's nice to hear that. Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, if y'all think of any questions, I'm always available by email. Or if there are other things you want me to talk about, I'll be doing 2 more learning bursts in July. So if there are topics you think of between them, please let me know. I have some good topics that came from our conversations last week already, but I'm happy to add them into my slides.
I just want to
thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, because I was just going to tell Kyle, thank you for everything. But yes, please start popcorning your questions. That is fine. Thank you.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you for covering vertical gardening. I think it's super helpful for us at Lucy Brock, but it's also super helpful, I think, like for me personally. So I think that's very helpful. Thank you.
Great. And I'm close enough to Lucy Brock where I could come and see it. That'd be a fun day. So let me know.
Really quick, while we're all here, I wanted to give a shout out because it is the lovely Sharonda Brown's birthday today. So I wanted to make sure we all had a chance to wish her a very, very happy birthday. Thank you for all you do for us, Sharonda.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you, guys.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Look, and here's my little friend over here. This is why we do what we do. Okay. You wait. There you go.
Hey, sweetie.
Thank you guys again so much. And if there are not any other questions, we're gonna restart everything as far as the learning burst again in July, for July and August. August, I can go ahead and tell you we're centered around eating with the children. So we're gonna do some on breastfeeding, and we're gonna do one on family style dining. And then we also have Kyle to do more gardening with us in July as well. So please stay tuned, and also know that Caroline and myself and Emma also, we will be coming to visit you guys in June and July also. So that's why we are taking a pause on the learning burst in June, because we actually do plan to start coming out to visit your beautiful centers and see all your wonderful gardens. Okay. So please get with your team leads if you haven't already, so you can kind of discuss when we should be in your area and, when we can come out and tour and everything. So thank you all so, so much.
I had a quick thing.